Cool. All right. So welcome everybody. We're approaching November and December. Right? And of course, I'm excited and I'm sure you are too. What is the most fun thing that occurs in December? Anybody want to take a shot at that? Something more fun than just about anything you could imagine. Don't hear anyone shouting out any examples, but I know what you're all thinking. Isn't December when the California Association of Realtors issues new forms? And the answer is yes, right? Something that we all get to look forward to. And because you're special people, I'm going to give you a peek at the soon to be released, revised, probably not going to be revised much more, but revised California Association of Realtors Residential Purchase Agreement. Isn't that just exciting? Isn't that fun and exciting, right? I'm sure you're all as thrilled as I am. So the purpose of today's class is to explain how to fill out the grid. I'm not going to spend much time on anything else. Later, there's a bunch of new forms, which makes everything more exciting. And I'm going to be doing some other classes on some of the revisions and some of the special forms that the California Association of Realtors legal department has added. How do I know all this? I just finished taking my recertification for the California Association Certified Forms Trainer. Just it's hot off the press. I mean, it's not with the press, but you know what I mean. So I've just had the privilege of sitting through many, many hours of listening to lawyers talk about these forms. And I do that, well, so you don't have to. So this is what the form, most of it is the same. The parts that are in red, they're changing somewhat. I'm not entirely sure why city, county, and all that. But we're going to go through this. We're going to spend most of our time just on the grid. But at the very beginning, the starting point is let me see. I don't. Maybe I should. The date. Never mind. Never mind. I knew I shouldn't do that. So date prepared. We're going to start with that. This is important. The date prepared is the date that you, as the whoever it is that's writing the offer, has prepared the document. That would seem kind of obvious. But when we're talking about addendums and amendments and all these other forms, offers and counteroffers and counteroffers, all of those other forms are going to make reference to the residential purchase contract, and then it says dated. Now, this sometimes is confusing. The dated does not refer to the date at which point this became a binding contract. That's the date when the last signature that was necessary was put on the document and communicated to the other party. It's not the date accepted, it's not the date finalized, it's the date it was prepared. Does that mean it's the date that you send it to the listing agent? No, it means the date that it was prepared. Could it be prepared a week in advance, 2 days? Yes, it's still the date that was prepared. And and one of the mistakes that sometimes agents make is in future documents where it says we're referring to the residential purchase contract dated, they either don't write in anything or they write in some other date other than that date. That's the date prepared. This is an offer from, and then notice it says buyer. That seems pretty self-explanatory. What if it's an LLC? What if it's a trust? Do you put in the name of the LLC or the name of the trust? Sure, that makes a lot of sense. Well, who's signing? When you sign, does it say the name of the LLC or the name of the trust? And then you sign? No, not really, because entities don't sign. So there's something called the personal representative, which is in zip forms. My goal was not to wander through zip forms today, but if you go, was there a question?
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Can you share your screen? Are you supposed to be sharing your screen?
It was.
Okay.
Thank you for saying that. It's off to the side. So a smooth beginning. Let me try it again. Share. Share. All right. How about that? Is that better? Thank you, Angela. I
You're
moved it over so I can see you I can't, when I'm doing this, I can't really see what's a hand raised because I have too many screens. And this keeps, I don't know what it keeps doing. There we go. All right. Can everybody see? Can you see where it says California Residential Purchase Agreement?
Looks nice.
Yeah. All right. So all we've covered so far is the date prepared, right? So if it's an offer from an entity, you put in the name of the entity here. Later, when we get to signing blocks, there's going to be the name of the person that signs on behalf of the entity. Property to be acquired is, you would put in the address. Sometimes you don't know. That may seem like an odd thing to say, but a lot of times if you're purchasing land or land where they've just built the house, then there's sometimes just a bunch of zeros and a placeholder in the street because they haven't really set up an address yet. But notice it says assessor's parcel numbers. There's an S after an O for numbers. So there could be more than one assessor's parcel number. How would that happen? Well, let's say somebody bought two legal lots next to each other, built one big house in the middle. It's going to have a street address, but it's going to have two APN numbers. And so we might put in multiple APNs, but it says postal mailing address may be different from city jurisdiction. Buyer is advised to investigate. There are, and this happens more often than you might think, properties where sometimes it says it's in, example, San Jose, and sometimes it says it's in Campbell. Sometimes you could find on a title company site, one of them says San Jose. You look at another title company site, it says Campbell. And why? Because it's right at the intersection. And even sometimes properties that are in San Jose are still part of the Campbell system, municipal system, and go to Campbell schools. It's not always as clear as you might think. Buyer is advised to investigate. Usually this comes down to, well, fire department, police department, and oftentimes, most importantly, well, schools, All right, agency disclosure. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this if you use MLS Connect and the Real Connect, which are two programs that are built into Zip Forms that imports information from the MLS or from title records. Sometimes it'll bring all this information, oftentimes not. So sometimes it won't have the seller, the listing broker, the seller's brokerage firm's license number. It just doesn't. And if you want to complain, why doesn't it always work? Because the multiple listing service has sometimes won't syndicate everything. It's just, it's just something they do. But you have to look at this and make sure all of that is filled out. Look at paragraph C. More than one brokerage represents, let me see if I can do this. More than one brokerage. There we go. No. It's just not going to like it, right? More than one brokerage, there we go, represents buyer, seller, and in Zip Forms, if you check any boxes, and the box is connected to a form, and here's our first one, really, there's a reference to the agency disclosure form, but form ABA, additional broker addendum, as soon as you check one of those two boxes, seller or buyer, that form automatically gets added. How many of these forms are connected in the RPA? This would be a trivial pursuit question that people still, I don't know, do trivial pursuit. And the answer is about 60. There are about 60 forms that show up if you check a box. Now, this, why would you have this? This is when you have cooperating brokers, either representing a buyer or representing a seller. Two different brokers are sharing a listing or sharing a buyer. By the way, up until a while ago, EXP didn't allow it. They've changed it. You can do it. You can co-list or be a co-broker for a buyer. You just click on that and it adds the forms. Now let's get to the good part, the grid. The grid. Purchase price makes sense. Now, all cash, if you check that box, it's going to gray out some of your options, like a loan and other things like that, but not appraisal. Close of escrow, you have two choices here. One choice is what most agents do, and I have to admit, I recently did this. You write in 30 days or something like that. Or you could write in the date. What's safer is to write in a date. And the reason I say that is, let's say 30 days. We put that because why not? But let's say the 30 days falls on a Saturday or Sunday. We're going to have to modify and we're going to have to amend the contract because it cannot close on a Saturday or Sunday. Why not? Because the contract says that closing means recording. And the county recorder's office don't work on Saturdays and Sundays. And the escrow companies do not work on Saturdays and Sundays. So we can't close on Saturday and Sundays, which means you have to amend it. What about Monday? That's a nice day. Well, sometimes in order to close on a day, you have to sign loan documents and or fund the day before. So the typical pattern is one day you sign the loan documents, the next day it funds. Hopefully, it's going to record that day, but it might record the next day. Well, in order to make sure that it records on Monday, you might have to fund on Friday. But then people are saying, wait a second, I'm paying interest on a loan for a house that I'm not allowed to get into. The other issue is, let's say you put down Friday is when the close of escrow day is, and anything goes wrong. Anything. Well, now we're not going to close on Friday. One of my clients, who's also a licensed real estate agent and therefore knew everything, he said, don't worry, I'm going to handle this part. And he was an engineer, right? And he had this great big chart, like a Gantt chart, and it was going to close on Friday. He had it set up so the moving vans were going to come on Saturday, the utilities were going to be shut off, everything was going to be switched. And he was handling that because he picked out his lender that he knew, and everything was going to be wonderful. And it was Tuesday that week. And I asked him if the CD, the closing disclosure, had been sent to him. And he said, not yet, probably tomorrow. I said, you realize you're not going to close on Friday? He said, oh, no, we have to. We're going to close on. And I'm like, no, because once the closing disclosure comes out, there's 3 days before you can sign the loan docs. Do the math, right? Then once that's done, then they have to file it's out. And now he's trying to beg the listing agent and the seller, will you let me in early because the movers are coming anyhow, and I'm not going to close on time, and they're shutting off my utilities, and they said, no, we're not going to let you move in until it closes, and that's going to be Monday. So if you see where I'm going with this, I like to pick something like, Tuesday. If I'm feeling it's a little shaky, I would rather have Tuesday because it would give us Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday to fix stuff and still close before we hit the weekend. And by the way, I made a video on this. I know, I made a video on everything just about. And one of the videos I made is called escrows do not always close on time. One of the things you should warn your buyer is escrows don't always close on time. Expiration of offer, 3 calendar days after buyer's signature. This is not, I don't know, I'm gonna have to work on, going to give that up. I must have like a highlighter someplace, but it's a new program. Does a seller typically need 3 days to decide whether or not they like your offer? How long, if you have a house and somebody made an offer to buy it, how long would it take you before you knew if you liked the offer or not? And the answer is it would probably be more like 3 minutes than it would be 3 days, right? I'm just saying. So if you give the listing agent and the seller 3 days, I know what I do. You give me an offer and I have 3 days to acceptance. First of all, I'm going to call everyone who downloaded any of the disclosures from my site, my Home Life Disclosure IO site, and I'm going to call them up and say, we have an offer. And when they say to me how much, I'm going to tell them. I'm going to tell them. And then I'll say, you need to beat this. All right. And then if somebody else gives me an offer and it also says I have 3 days, and then I call another agent and they say, well, do you have any offers? I'll say 2, this is the highest one. I had this happen on one of my listings where the original offer came in like at 1.1, and eventually that buyer purchased it, but at 1.2, because each time I worked it up by telling everybody what the highest offer was. By the way, don't tell me that's illegal, unethical, and immoral. It is not. The residential listing agreement says that the listing agent can tell people the amount of and the number of offers received. The PRBS form, possible representation of more than one buyer and seller, says that this is not confidential, the offer, and it can be disclosed to other buyers. And the statewide buyer and seller advisory actually has a paragraph warning, that's one of those things we never read, but warning buyers that their offers are not confidential. So what I would recommend is that you call the listing agent up and you say, hey, if I got you an offer this afternoon, how soon would is your client around? Are they available? How long would it take for us to get an acceptance? And then you don't want to give them 3 calendar days unless there's some really good reason. Right? They're in the Arctic and they're in a spot where there's no Wi-Fi. I don't know. Initial deposit. Within 3, I really hope this would work. Let me try one more time because I'm a glutton. There we go. Cool. Notice the default 3 business days. Expiration of offer, is 3 calendar days. So I wrote an offer on a property in San Jose on Thursday. The seller countered. There was a multiple counter offer. This, by the way, is a Silicon Valley story. My client said, what can we do to get this property? And I said, we should counter their counter offer. Right? And we did, but we raised the price. We did not lower it. And the reason we countered back at a higher price is because, let's say, both buyers accepted the multiple counter offer. At that point, we're even. But if we bump it a little bit, we're not even anymore. The agent, the listing agent, did not, in her counter, I wrote it so it said just the default, 3 business days. She did not counter that. When our transaction coordinator was looking and I was having her write up our buyer counter offer and she was looking at the text messages, she noticed that the listing agent kept asking that we put the deposit in by the next business day. She asked if she should put that in our counter offer. I said, no, don't do that. So what happened is that everything is accepted on Thursday, and that part never got changed. Now the listing agent is texting me saying, "Are you going to put the money in on Friday?" And I said, "I'll ask." But you see, my responsibility to my client is to tell them the truth, which is you're not required to put it in on Friday. What day, if it was on Thursday that the offer was accepted, what day would be the third business day?
Tuesday.
Tuesday. She's gone nuts, right? And refused to change the status to pending because we hadn't put the deposit in. Now, I didn't want to rub salt in the wound, but later, if there's a conflict, I've already threatened to do it once. And by the way, our communication has improved significantly. I actually got my pleasure from her today in the text. But what I'm holding over her head is that I could report her to the multiple listing service and she'd be fine. The MLS rule says you have 24 hours to report a status change. And I didn't want to because the deposit wasn't in. That's not an exception. So if you're the listing agent, you might want to look at this and see, does it say 3 business days? Because the next business, does everybody understand what the issue is here? Up until we actually put the money in on Monday, but we weren't obligated to do it on Tuesday. Well, let's say we changed our mind. That's why she didn't want to change the status to pending. Let's say my client, woke up and said, "I think I made a terrible mistake. I don't want to buy this property." We just wouldn't put in the deposit and say, "We're canceling," and there's really nothing that can be done, right? Just nothing that can be done, right? Other than they're unhappy. Increased deposit, you're probably never going to use this. It used to be a common thing. It's still common in commercial transactions. And what an increased deposit is that we would give, and in commercial, we still do this, we would put maybe 1% down as an earnest money deposit, with the remainder of the deposit being increased when we removed our contingencies. That used to be a standard thing, by the way, in residential. The market has shifted to a seller's market. If it becomes a buyer's market again, we might see it. But you understand, sometimes buyers are thinking, well, why should I give them 3% when I have all these contingencies and I may not even want to buy the property because they don't have any inspections and reports. So I just want to give them, $500, $1,000 now. I'll increase it later if I remove my contingencies. Loan amount. Is this an important thing to fill out? Well, the first and the percentage of the purchase price, that sounds important. Is it a fixed rate or an adjustable rate? Well, not to exceed, that's a maximum interest rate. Buyer not to pay points above a certain amount. Let's say, now, first of all, this is really important if you have a financing contingency. It's important. If you don't have a financing contingency, it's not meaningful, but not as important. And what I mean by, if you have a financing contingency and you don't write in a maximum interest rate, and interest rates go up, and the buyer says, well, I just don't want that loan at that rate, too bad. That's not a condition of the contract, right? The contract is not conditioned on the buyer getting a particular interest rate or below it. Not. So if the buyer could still afford to buy the house at the higher interest rate they have not, that's not an out, right? Because they talk to the lender and lender says, well, no, they really don't want to do it because the interest rate just went up. But yeah, they could afford to if they wanted to. Well, then that's not a legitimate use of the loan contingency. Even if you don't have a loan contingency, sometimes sellers and listing agents are curious as to what you're planning on getting. And if you write in an interest rate that's ridiculously low, see, one of the things we used to do when we had loan contingencies. And in Silicon Valley, very few people do, but outside of Silicon Valley, there's more loan contingencies. What we would do sometimes to be sneaky is we would figure out what the interest rate was from, get the loan agent to tell us, and we would put in an interest rate a little bit low enough that it probably doesn't exist. All right, so that way we would have an out, even if the loan was being approved but we didn't want to buy the house, we could say, well, the interest rate, it's too high. So if you're the listing agent and there's a loan contingency and there's an interest rate, you might want to ask the loan agent or talk to the loan agent who wrote it, whether or not that's a reasonable rate or not. FHA, VA, if you check those boxes, other forms magically appear. I'm not going to go into them. I'm going to do another class going through a lot of the different addenda. Let's just say that FHA and VA, if you check those boxes, you have an appraisal contingency. What if we waive the appraisal contingency? If you check those boxes, you have an appraisal contingency. Can't we remove the appraisal? No, not if it's FHA or VA. Additional amount financed, is there a second? Sometimes our seconds are hidden, where if the buyer has the money, but doesn't want to use the money, then the buyer won't mention the fact that they're actually getting a second loan. Because if you're the listing agent and you see two loans, and there's a loan contingency, there's a contingency for both loans, well, there's two possible things that could go wrong. Right? Does everybody understand that if you have that other financing, that's going to make the seller maybe a little more nervous? But sometimes, you just have to tell them the truth, right? Depending on how long it's been on the market and how many other offers. Yell at me if there's something, or raise your hand or text Angela and she'll yell at me if you want me to explain something. Occupancy type, notice its default is primary. Now, if you use the RIPA, the Residential Income Purchase Agreement, it's switched because the assumption is you're using it because the property is already rented out, therefore it's an investment. But this is the residential purchase agreement. It's assumed that it's primary, but you could check the other boxes. Balance of down payment, purchase price total, the system will add all that up for you. Let's get to the good stuff. Where does it talk about my commission? So paragraph G, G1, G2, and G3. G1 is a seller credit to the buyer. Notice it says for closing costs. There's a question I saw, I peeked at it. Properties with solar panels, do they usually involve two loans? The answer is no, not necessarily. They could, but the question is, that would be another class. I have a video, you'll be surprised to hear, on shining the light on solar panels. We'll do a solar thing later, but it all depends. It could, but it may not. So G1, seller credit. Maybe I shouldn't look at the chat. Is that a good idea, Angela? Because I'm easily distracted.
Nothing in the chat.
All right, I will try not to look at it. How about that? Because I see squirrels all the time. All right.
Oh, hold on, wait. There's offers made for properties with solar panels. Do they usually involve two loans?
And the answer is not necessarily, because the solar panels could be leased, they could be under a PACE loan, which has to be paid off. It may not be assumable, whatever their existing loan is, but normally a lender like Envoy Mortgage, for example, is not going to lend you money on the solar panels. All right, and if they're owned, it's all thrown in, but most lenders don't have, except solar company lenders don't have loans for just the solar panels. But y'all can correct me if I'm wrong, but usually they don't make second loans for solar panels.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
And if I am wrong, just shout it out. I'm seller credit to buyer. Notice it says for closing costs. That's pretty much the only thing that lenders will let you have a credit for. And what they really mean is non-recurring closing costs. Right? What does that mean? Well, there are recurring and non-recurring. Recurring would be like interest payments, right? That sort of thing. It's like a recurring nightmare, right? Something that comes back again and again and again. But everything else is a non-recurring or a closing cost. Points could be a non-recurring cost. Credits, all that stuff could be a closing cost. So if the seller is giving the buyer a credit to buy down the interest rate, or because there's repairs, we would put it in there. Then you might ask, what about G2, additional seller credit? Why do we have that? Why couldn't we just all put it in G1? And you guys are going to love to hear the answer. It's because they don't trust real estate agents. I was going to tell Angela the story. We were talking about something else that really involved me, and I grew up where there were cows and horses and things like that. And the cows would walk down a path, right? And if you were cutting brush and you piled it on the path, they would just walk into the brush. And then eventually they would learn that there was something there, and then they'd walk around. Then you'd remove the stuff, and what would they do? They would still walk around even though it wasn't even there. Now, I'm not saying that we're all cows, but the reason they put in G2 is because they didn't want to renumber the section. Because real estate agents have now hardwired into their brain that the commission is in 3G3. And if they took out 3G2 and made 3G3, 3G2, real estate agents, some of them, their brains would explode, right? They wouldn't be able to handle the fact that it's moved up. So this is true. I heard this from their form committee, is that they left in 3G2, not because you need it, but because it keeps 3G3 in the right spot. That's a true story, by the way. Both the one with the cows and the reason why it's 3G3. So what is 3G? But you could, if you wanted to break it up, you could say, well, one is for repairs, the other one is for closing costs. By the way, be careful about writing in a contract that you're getting a credit for repairs. Sometimes that's a flag to the lender that there's something wrong with the property. And then they're going to go, oh, there's something wrong with the property. We should mention that to the appraiser. And maybe we ought to get that fixed. And maybe the appraiser ought to rethink the appraisal, right? So it's much safer just to say credit for closing costs, right? Just say that. Also, you need to know, and this is covered in another section, that there is a limit on how much that credit can be. The limit is set by lenders. Now, the limit could be as much as 6%, depending on the kind of loan. What happens, and I do this with agents where the agent is giving it credit, the seller is giving it credit, and I'm adding it all up. And I said, you ought to talk to the loan agent because this looks like more credit than is allowed. And the contract says that if the credit here is greater than the amount the lender allows, that's it. The buyer doesn't get a reduced price, doesn't get any other compensation, nothing. The buyer just doesn't get to use the whole credit. And by the way, that makes them very unhappy, right? When they thought they were going to get 30,000 and they don't. Paragraph G3, 3G3. Check the box, seller payment to compensate buyer broker. Out of the proceeds, you write into a percent. You could write in a percent and another amount. What would that be? Sometimes people say, well, I want you to pay the transaction coordinator. Or you could just say a flat amount for the whole thing, right? So percent and money, or just money. One of the differences from the older versions of this is that it no longer refers to the BRBC agreement and asks that the seller get a copy of it. It doesn't say that anywhere anymore. Can the seller ask to see your BRBC agreement to see whether or not the amount you wrote in here matches the amount you wrote in there? They could ask. Are you obligated to do it? Not unless they put it in a counteroffer. And the question would be why, right? The seller does not enforce that rule, right? The rule about all the rules about the MLS and the amount of compensation can't exceed the amount that it says in the buyer represent. They don't enforce that rule, so it generally doesn't come up. You don't have to. I get asked this a lot. Do I have to give them a copy of my BRBC? The answer is no. Doesn't say that anywhere in the contract. It used to, but it doesn't. Verification of all cash. Notice it says attached to offer. Let me see if I can, yeah, attached to offer. That's the default, attached to the offer. That's the default. That's, oops, way too much. But I'll get better at this. Attached to the offer, that's the default. So if you don't check any of those boxes, you better have it attached to the offer. What is verification of all cash? It doesn't define it in the contract. Could it be a screenshot of bank statements or a screenshot of a stock portfolio, or the lender, the loan agent in their pre-approval letter could say, and we have verified that the buyer has sufficient assets in order to close the transaction. It could be a letter from the bank saying this guy's got enough money. I've had clients that wouldn't show a screenshot of their bank account. That's because they had so much money in it. It was like, that's nobody's business. I'm not going to show you that. So the lender would write a letter that says, we've seen it and there's enough money. Pre-qualification, pre-approval, or fully underwritten. As you move from one to the other, your offer becomes stronger. If you check the box fully underwritten, I'm asking, if I'm the listing agent, why do you need a loan contingency if you have one? If you check the box pre-approved, I might still ask, why do you need a loan contingency if it's really pre-approved? I'm just saying. Pre-qualification doesn't mean anything other than you've said numbers to a loan agent who said, well, if this is all true, right, then you can afford this. But nobody's really checked. Final verification of condition. Normally I just leave it here. This is not a contingency. An assignment request is 17 days. They've limited it because what will happen is people will get into contract and then they'll say, wouldn't it be better if we had the property go into our trust? Oh, wouldn't it be better if we started an LLC, right? And so during escrow, right, they're trying to set up a trust or an LLC. And the contract says that the seller the seller has to say it's okay, but they can't be unreasonable and say it's not okay. But what would happen is it's like 2 days before escrow closes, and now they want to change who the buyer is. And there's a question of what about all the documents, that do they need to be re-signed? They have to have their initials on the beginning. We'll talk about that in another session because I'm going to be doing classes on all the different forms. Loan 17, notice 17, 17, 17, all the way down. Right, there's just all these 17s. Why does it say 17? Well, they were debating, should it say 15 or 21? And they said, well, we really can't decide. 21 seems a little too long, 15 might be too short, so they stuck with 17. That's the reason. You notice you can remove two contingencies in the RPA. One of them is loan and the other one is appraisal. But the rest of them, you're going to need to use the form down here, the C.A.R. form. The C.A.R. form. No, this part here is called a appraisal gap clause. And what an appraisal gap clause says is, I'm willing to buy your house, but only if it appraises for at least this much. So let's say it's $1 million, and you're saying, you understand if they're buying a house and it costs $1 million, the question is, what if it doesn't appraise? They say, well, I don't want to have an appraisal contingency because I really want to buy. Well, what if it doesn't appraise? If it appraised for 9 80, that would require you to put in 20,000 extra. Are you willing to do that? And they say, well, yeah, I guess I would. Great. How about if it appraises for 970? Are you willing to do that? 30 grand. I guess. All right. How about if it appraises for 950? Oh no, that's too low. Oh no. I don't have 50,000. If I did, I wouldn't want to do it. Great. So what we want is a number. Now, what's a little tricky about this is, let's say the 25,000 is as much as they'll go. We're offering $1 million, then we would say it must appraise for at least 975. What if the seller counters us? Right? We offer $1 million and the seller counters us and they say, we want $1,010,000, $1,025,000. Does that change? And the answer is yeah. The gap doesn't change, but the minimum changes. So if the gap is $25,000 and because of counters, the price goes up, the minimum goes up, but it's still a $25,000 gap. Does that make sense? I'm looking to see if Angela's nodding. I don't know. Right. So the gap, notice it doesn't say the gap. It says the minimum, but based upon the minimum and the offer price, there's a gap. That gap stays even if there's a counter, not the minimum. All right. There'll be another one. Investigation of the property, 17 days is the default. You could do it in 12. You could do all of these in 12 usually, if you had to. Notice informational access. This number here almost never gets changed. When will I learn to stop trying? It never gets changed. I don't think I've ever seen a purchase agreement where somebody went to the trouble of changing that. They just leave it. Notice it says it's not a contingency. It does not create cancellation rights. Well, we've had a case where we have a investigation contingency that's coming due. We want a contractor to go look at the property to give us a bid. The listing agent is saying, no, it's not convenient. The owner doesn't want to do it. We're not ready, but we're going to make you remove your contingency. We're going to give you a 2-day notice to perform. And what we did is we gave them a 2-day notice to perform, because it says later in the contract that if you do not allow informational access, then you cannot enforce the investigation contingency. You understand? You can't say, well, you have 17 days to investigate the property. Good luck, because we're going to lock you out and never let you in. Good luck. Right? Well, they can't do that. So if they don't give you access, then that obviates, cancels essentially their ability to enforce the investigation contingency, because it says we have a right to do all these things, and included, by the way, on that list is having a contractor. So next Thursday, I'm going to go visit the purchase that I have going on right now. We made the offer without any contingencies. No investigation contingency. Do we still have a right to go in and access the property? The answer is yes. Notice it says that this is not, it does not create it, and it applies. This is the part. It applies even if contingencies are removed. See that? Even if you don't have contingencies, you still have a right to go in and investigate, measure, have a contractor give you bids, have a decorator look at it. Insurance doesn't necessarily take 17 days. If you ask the insurance agent, here's the address, they would give, like in ours, we're finding out we may have to add a water auto shut off leak valve or something. But you might want to make sure that you thought about insurance prior to writing the offer, and to make sure that the buyer can get it. Review of seller documents. In Silicon Valley, They usually give you everything, the TDS, the SPQ, the whole stack, a termite report, a property inspection, a roof inspection, everything. And if they do that, then you can ask for that to be less. Notice it says 17 days after acceptance or 5 days after delivery. Right, but we asked for them to remove that. Notice there's a removal of contingency. We asked for them to remove it. The preliminary title report, so you can see if there's other liens on the property. Common interest disclosures, that's HOA documents. Solar stuff, leased or liened, is usually propane tanks or solar panels. There's a lot of issues with that, which I'm not going to cover today. And sale of buyer's property, this is the big one, the bad one. And the C.A.R. form COP, if you check the box, is attached. This used to be the COP form, and I'm going to do a class on it. The most hated form among the C.A.R. library was the COP form. It is not the most hated form anymore. It is the second most hated form. And if somebody, for a cookie, can anybody tell me what is the most hated form? See, anybody want to type that in? I can see people are typing madly. All the forms I have, the SPRB, nah, but no. BRBC, no, that's a good one. That's how we get paid. You guys haven't filled out. How about fire hardening and defensible space? How about that one? That's the most hated form. And I can see why. So if we're removing contingencies, we would click on removal or waiver of contingencies. How many contingencies are there? There's a whole bunch. And we're going to be doing another class on the removal of contingencies, and I'm going to go through that form. I promised that I would actually just talk about the grid today. I think I promised Angela I wasn't going to wander off topic again and start talking about it. But I'm going to break it into a series. We're going to go through all the new forms, all of that sort of stuff. Possession on recordation, when is that? That's when it closes. What if it closes late in the afternoon? Let's say it funds Friday morning, but late Friday morning. And it doesn't make it out for recording that day. It doesn't get recorded because there's a cutoff. So the buyer's money is in escrow. But the buyer doesn't own the house because it didn't record, because the lender funded too late in the day. Can the buyer move in? No, because possession is not based on funding. It's based upon recording. Would you be unhappy if you were the buyer, knowing that your money was in escrow and the seller had it? The seller has the money. You understand? You oftentimes at that point, or the money's at least in escrow, just sitting there. But you don't get to move in because it didn't record. By the way, I've had one transaction where the lender, because they found out that the buyer was, my buyer, was being laid off at Cisco. They heard this on a Friday. They took the money out of escrow. They had funded already, and they took the money out of escrow. So it wouldn't record and it wouldn't close. It ain't over till it's over. Seller occupied or vacant units, close of escrow date, or so many days afterwards. So what this would want to trigger is the SIP form. There's now a new advisory. I'm going to spend some time talking about that in another class. Not today. Occupied by tenants. What is a tenant? Well, you might think it's a renter, right? Isn't that a tenant, a renter? What about joint tenants? What about tenants in common? They're not renters, but they're still called tenants. So for those of you that care about this stuff, the word tenant or tenancy comes from the Latin word tenare, which means to hold. like tenacious people don't let go and tenured teachers can't be fired. So it literally means who has a hold of the property. Now, in the contract, they're defined as people that are 18 years of age or older, that are not on title, that are living at the property. And they call those people, by the way, people with the age of majority. Because if you're under 18, unless you're an emancipated minor, you're in the age of minority. And you could say, well, then if you're over 18, you're in the age of adultery, but that didn't sound good. So they said, well, that doesn't sound good. So you're either in minority or majority. So if you're 18 or older, or an emancipated minor, and you're living in the property, you're a tenant. The nephew who's in the back room, right? So what if they don't leave when escrow closes? What if they don't leave? Hire a lawyer, evict them. Yeah, that doesn't sound good. So if there's anyone there that's not a child, an adult living in the property who's not on title, not a seller in this contract, you should use the TOPA form. Let's say it's a married couple. And one of them is on title and the other is not. Would you use the TOPA form? The answer is yes. Well, how could this be? Ever heard of a divorce? So you have two people that are living in the property. One is on title, one is not. One wants the divorce and the other does not. Can you imagine that there have been times where one of them just won't move out, just won't leave? And they're not on title and you understand, if anyone is in the property that is an adult and is not on title, you want to use the TOPA form. We'll talk about that later. Documents, seller delivery of documents, you ought to have them if you're the listing agent before the offer is made. An example, the transfer disclosure statement law, the California Civil Code section 1102 says that depending upon the type of delivery. So if you hand somebody the TDS form, they have 3 days to rescind the contract. If you email them the form, which is what's done most of the time, they have 5 days to rescind the contract. However, if you give them the TDS before they write the offer, they have no days, 0 days to move out. And by the way, if you're the listing agent, you should look at the transfer disclosure form. I looked at the one in the transaction I'm in. I should look to see if the listing, no, she's not in. And I noticed that she made an error on a couple of the checkboxes. I'm not going to point this out to her, but if my client gets to a point and says, I don't want to buy this anymore, it says in 1102.4, that sub 4, that if there is a material inaccuracy, the seller has to amend their transfer disclosure statement. And the Civil Code says that if the seller amends the transfer disclosure statement, it triggers a new right of rescission. Doesn't it have to be done in good faith? Because it's a picky thing that I found. And the Civil Code says that the seller filling out the transfer disclosure has to do it in good faith, but not the buyer's right of rescission. It's absolute. If they amend it, if it's wrong, they have to amend it. We'll give them a notice to perform. If it's wrong, they have to amend it. And if they amend it, the buyer can back out. What about we've removed the contingencies? It says in 1102 of the California Civil Code that this right cannot be waived by a buyer. Cannot be waived. Pay attention and make sure that your clients, if you're representing the seller, have answered all the questions on the TDS and the SPQ because it says in the contract that they all have to be answered or they have to be before it's considered done. Seller delivery of documents. I always look and see if they didn't check a box. I've trained the transaction. We don't say anything about it now because we wait in case we need an out. Sign and escrow provisions, time to pay, HOA fees, smoke detectors, all of that. Why are there intentionally left blank? Paragraph 3.0 is left blank. Why? And you'll see that there was another one that was left blank. Here, why? And the answer is, remember the story about the real estate agents that would walk into the pile of leaves? I mean, the cows that would walk into the pile of leaves. Remember that story? So 3I looks like 31 and 3O looks like 30. And the people who wrote these forms were afraid that real estate agents would have difficulty with that level of, confusion. So they just left it blank. All right, but the real reason, that's it. Items included or excluded. You should, so when it washers and dryers, don't ask for washers and dryers if they don't have them. I see agents then just check all the boxes. Well, we don't have this. My goal, if I write an offer, is to write an offer so that the seller does not have to counter. That's my goal. All right, I'm not trying to sneak something in because it's a competitive market. The one that we bought, by the way, there was at least 5 other offers along the way, right? I'm just saying. And the microwaves, they're not talking about the ones that are built in. They're talking about a microwave sitting on the counter. Right? I'm just saying, because later it says in the contract what all the things that are included, which is everything else. If you've got a long list and you start typing and it exceeds the amount of space, it creates a text overflow addendum. This is, and there may not be, I'm sorry, but I may not have put in your contact information to NHD. Let me just cover this. If it says both, like here it says both, and then both. If you check both, it means 50-50. Just saying. If you have it NHD, you should always, if you represent the buyer, ask for it to be. And by the way, usually what we would do is we would say we want the seller to pay, right? We want the seller to pay, and we want it to be environmental. And if you have a company you like, you better write in their name here, otherwise the seller's going to pick. Optional wildlife disclosure. If we're doing it, it's almost always done by the seller, but that's when we get the fire hardening. I'm not going to do that now. Smoke alarms. This could be anybody, but we would typically say seller. Government required point of sale inspections and reports, corrective remedial actions. So if you say, well, we're going to leave it blank because we really don't know, or the buyer's going to pay, or the seller's going to pay, you can't make these things go away. Because a point of sale means it has to be done before the transaction can close. And if it's a required point of sale, like a sewer lateral, that you have to have sewer lateral certification. Some places in California have minimum insulation. There's some counties where you have to have low flow toilets and plumbing fixtures, and you might say, well, that's true throughout the state. Yeah, but some counties, they're going to come and look at your toilet and your shower, and they're going to run water and do all that sort of stuff, and you have to get a certificate or you cannot sell the property. If you're an agent, if you're the listing agent, you ought to know what these are for your listing. And if you represent a buyer, you ought to know what they are for that property. You ought to know. How would you find out? Well, usually the MLS has a list. If you search local area disclosures for Santa Cruz, you would find it. If you ask the escrow company, but if there's a $9,000 sewer lateral thing that has to be done, it would be better to figure that out now and decide who's going to pay for it. Escrow fee and title fee. The reason we have each pays their own fees because people in Southern California tend to do that. In Northern California, it depends on the county who customarily pays what. If you don't know, you could ask AI, or I use ChicagoTitleTransferTax.com, and they'll tell you what's customary. Listing agents generally like to see it's customary, whatever that is. County transfer tax is almost always the seller pays. City transfer tax, it depends. Again, you'd have to check and see if there is one and who typically pays it. Most of these they've already figured out. HOA fees, typically the seller pays it. The transfer fees, notice it says, move out fee, a move in fee the buyer would pay, but that's something you could negotiate. Private transfer fees don't come up very often. This is where a subdivision has made an agreement that every time we sell a lot or a house, that we're going to pay somebody a transfer fee. Usually that's found in the prelim. The home warranty is doesn't cover everything. The buyer could waive it. Sometimes real estate agents, as a closing gift, purchases one for the buyer, right? Or we oftentimes ask for the seller to pay, and we would pick. It's always good for you to, if you're the buyer's agent, to pick the home warranty plan. And notice it gives you a choice over here to say issued by, right? You can see that. And you'd write in a cost. How would you know what to write in? You would need to get a home warranty brochure. How would you get a home warranty brochure? Type in Fidelity National Home Warranty, American Home Shield, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they'll give you a brochure and you look at it and you can calculate what it would cost. You add a little bit. If you're the buyer's agent and you're purchasing one for your buyer, you would check buyer waives the home warranty, because we're not putting in the contract and it's a credit you would make in escrow. And by the way, get them the best plan available. Get them the Platinum Plus plan, because you're doing this so that you would have some way of contacting them, but because the home warranty company is going to send marketing materials with your name on it to that buyer who's now the owner. And what you don't want to happen is that if, let's say, the air conditioning starts working or is making a lot of noise, and the owner calls the home warranty company and says, hey, I got a home warranty with you guys, and the air conditioning seems to be having problems, and they look it up and they say, oh, you're not covered. Yeah, you see, your agent, right, got you the basic plan, right? The minimum plan, but no, you're not covered. You don't want that. Right, because this went from a good thing to a bad thing, because now they're like, well, that cheap, you didn't buy me a good home warranty plan. So when I buy a home warranty plan, I pay for the best one, so that then it would be covered. And now we've come to other terms. You do not need to write in things here. Most of the time when I see agents write in things here, they're writing in things for who do I like for the home warranty. That's going to change. I've been using Fidelity National Title, but the place we're going to have our own home warranty company, but I use Fidelity if you want to know. And does the home warranty work for the buyer only if the buyer has a home inspection in place? It has nothing to do with the home inspection. Nothing to do with the home inspection. You could buy a home warranty today on your house, whether you're in contract or not, or purchase it recently. Other terms, what might you put in here without having somebody say you shouldn't have said that? If you're related to the buyer or something like that, you could put that in. All right. Buyer's agent is a relative, or buyer's related to the buyer. Agent is related to the buyer, something like that. I don't know, did I lose everybody? But do you have a quick thing you could say? Otherwise, we're running a little over.
I can share rates quickly.
Quickly, absolutely.
Yeah. So we heard about Feds cutting the rate. Soon it should be in the market, rate will be updated, but current rate for 30-year fix 6.0, 15-year fix 5.5, 30-year FHA 5.75, 30-year jumbo 7-year arm 5.75, and VA starts with 5.85. So rates are good. I think if anyone who's uh, start doing the looking the buying the house, I think it's good time to get the pre-approval.
Sounds good. Thanks a lot, everybody. We're gonna, if you enjoyed this, wait till we go through fire hardening, all those other fun forms coming up. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye, Mike. Thank you.